So in one decision I made as an architect for a foundation on a single residential project, that's the equivalent of driving a car for 60 years. One of the main outcomes of Grenfell is that it's harder to build with materials that are deemed combustible, and the Wagyu beef is aluminum, right? But we, as architects, we like eat...
Delicious.
My name is Kelly Alvarez Doran. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Half Climate Design. We're a design support company. We provide support to architects and builders, developers, policymakers to reduce the emissions of construction and lead to regenerative ways of building.
Kelly, thank you very much for joining us. And Urban Forecast is a podcast about the future of cities. The reason that we met was on LinkedIn. I said something, you disagreed with me. I think you were right.
I have disagreed. Yeah.
And what I was saying basically was that I was actually talking very specifically about offices, that embodied, the operational carbon was more important to think about in terms of London offices than the embodied carbon. And you told me why I was wrong, and I was wrong, and I now totally am on your side, that embodied carbon becomes at a certain point more important than the operational. Do you want to give us a little bit of a background and then kind of lead into that question?
Sure. Well, I'm gonna answer the question and then come to how I arrived at it, perhaps.
Good.
So it's not an either or. It's not embodied or operational. It's both over time. It's whole life carbon. And every building, the answer is it depends. Like that office building, how old is it? How often has it been refurbished? What are the kind of future plans for it? How does it currently perform operationally? And what does it take then in new materials or new systems and their emissions to then reduce it? And how do you look at that over time? That's the critical thing that we need to think about. Hey, they will net out after 10 years, and after that point, the total emissions profile is less, for instance. So the time portion is critical, and we need to see both of these together. And it really depends. I just was working with an architect here on refurbishment, complete envelope change. By doing that retrofit, basically it took the emissions profile down from, I think, 11 tons a year to 1. And to do it, it only required 10 tons. So within a year or two, that thing is now, much lower trajectory. Now I've come to this kind of perspective, this full perspective, I guess the way to tell it, 10 years ago, I moved to Rwanda to work with Mass Design Group and lead their office in Africa. And working there really opened my eyes to what things are made out of and who makes them. And that eventually led to working with researchers at MIT, Catherine DeWolf, who's not the ETH. The first time I'd heard the term embodied carbon was 8 years ago. And for me, it was like a real gut punch of like, wow, where was this in my education? To go back and then begin to look at your work through that lens, it was like once you see embodied carbon, it's hard to unsee it. And it's really where our agency is as architects. We specify, we build. How buildings are operated, or ultimately we can inform them, but it's out of our control at that point. And then more recently, through teaching at the University of Toronto, I teach architects how to do LCA, and I co-teach a seminar with looking at both the operations and the embodied carbon. And we've been looking at the University of Toronto's own buildings through this lens. What did it take to build them, and how do they operate? And it really is different on building types. Residential, it's all about embodied carbon. Labs, it's all about operational carbon because of just how many air changes they require or how buildings are used. So I think it's really critical that we look at all buildings on a case by case through that dual lens.
Welcome.
Sorry, that's way too long of an
That's
answer.
right. No, it's good. I think I actually ask you a clarification, because I think what would be useful also just as a little explainer, because I think we bandy these terms around quite a lot, but like operational carbon, embodied carbon, whole life carbon, and what are the kind of metrics on those, just so that people have can get a grasp of what these different things are?
Sure. Okay. So operational carbon is the carbon emissions associated with the heating, cooling, plug loads, like energy use of your building. So, right now the emissions of this podcast is coming from the lights, the mic, and the laptop, and the heat in the room. And that is, how that energy is derived is on the UK's power grid, largely, mostly electrical here. And that electricity is produced through a variety of sources. And you can go and you can look right now. I think it's roughly, per kilowatt hour. I think in the UK, it's relatively greenish in the grid if you looked nationally or internationally. UK's got pretty green power, really green on a windy day.
Yeah,
that's our operational carbon. Okay. The embodied carbon is then all the energy, all the emissions associated with the making of the equipment that we're using in this podcast. So, the metal in this microphone, the metal in the computer, the metal in the stands of the cameras that are looking at us, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there's a lot of embodied carbon in the equipment of this podcast. As you can imagine, this was like, this metal was mined somewhere. It was processed, it was made into a microphone. At every one of those stages, energy is expended and it's emitting, carbon into the atmosphere, depending on, what material it is and where in the world that's happening. And some parts of the world have much more intensive grid production than others. And that's really important to think about. So, if this metal is smelted and made into a microphone in China on coal power, it's got pretty high embodied carbon, for instance. So I think that in a building context, you can apply it to anything. But when you look around the room that we're in, the radiator, the brick, the windows that are 100-something years old, all of these have a carbon profile, and that's the embodied carbon of the material itself. And then together, this is how we think whole life is over the life of a thing or the life of a building. What is the total carbon profile of that building over time?
And one of the challenges we've been having is that people find the tangibility of these kind of things. How do you actually understand?
Yeah.
If you're just, okay, we're all architects here and we're slightly in our own echo chamber, how do you understand what that means to a normal person?
Yeah. Okay. So I think one way is to translate it into, a decision that you can make. Or, like flights are a good metric, or I like to use, if you're driving a car for a whole year. As a Canadian, if I drove a car all year and was filling my gas up and driving kind of as a regular Canadian, thousands of kilometers every year, I would emit 1 ton of carbon driving that car. But one foundation on the cottage that I showed you earlier is 60 tons of carbon, right? So in one decision I made as an architect for a foundation on a single residential project, that's the equivalent of driving a car for 60 years. Right. So these are the size and the scale of the decisions we make in the built environment are so disproportionate to other professions, and it's like why we have, I think our responsibilities therefore that much greater to really understand this. And
do you think in the UK, so our sort of like a lot of the kind of expressions of net zero really focus on operational in the UK, and it feels a little bit like that's a way of architects maybe appeasing their own consciences, but you have the benefit of having seen how 2 different countries operate, Canada and and Rwanda third. But the UK, we've really got a problem with embodied carbon because of the way that we've handcuffed ourselves in response to Grenfell.
Yeah. Well, I think the response to Grenfell, I think the overall focus on operational carbon to date, it's not unique to the UK. I think in Canada it's been the same. Internationally, it's the same. For the last, certainly, I'm going to guess we're probably about the same age. As long as I've been practicing, our focus on like how we've termed sustainability or how we're dealing with it is like we're only looking at operations. And the minute you open your other eye and see embodied, it's like, oh, whoa, wait a minute. And our policies really need to focus not just at thinking about, all right, column A is operations, column B is embodied. You report both of them independent, because they're often in conflict with each other. In some cases, I think, triple pane curtain wall is a good example of a product focused on reducing your operational emissions, completely blind to the embodied carbon of that decision, right? At no point does that extra pane of glass pay off, I would argue, in a whole life carbon perspective. And conversely, like if you go, you can go down like, hey, we really want to reduce our embodied carbon, and you might have poor performance. So how these things have to be linked over time. And I think it's not unique to the United Kingdom. Canada's in the same situation. The one country that's already made the leap to whole life carbon is Denmark. And like for me, they're the model we should be thinking about. Specific to Grenfell, and my reading of what's happened since Grenfell is that it's had the effect of making some of these lower carbon materials harder to work with,
almost impossible on the scale of projects that we work on.
Yeah,
it's, I mean, like, there's one project that I'm working on where we're really able to use timber, and that is because that the company that we're working with, the developer we're working with, is like partly owned by a forestry company, and that's the only one where we're able to like crowbar in the use of timber. Because we work on buildings typically over 18 meters or over 11 meters, where we've it's very difficult to, even when with the best will in the world and the most committed developer, we are having to work with a panel of insurers to work out what the solution is going to be. It's not feasible on every project to do that. The two-story house seems to be the only place that you could otherwise use timber, and we don't design a lot of those.
No. I mean, we were talking about this earlier. Our current regulations, our planning policy, the frameworks that we're operating under, both, not just in the UK, but more broadly, they are very prohibitive to reducing carbon and cost of construction. The regulations we operate under need dramatic reform. They need to be simpler, and they need to be performance-based and based on reality. The fact that one of the main outcomes of Grenfell is that it's harder to build with materials that are deemed combustible, specifically wood and other bio-based materials, is crazy, because there was no bio-based material on Grenfell. And I think that if we had an actual evidence-based, that our policy was evidence-based, it would not be as difficult to be building all these materials in the UK right now, because fire doesn't behave differently in Canada or Sweden does in the UK. It burns the same.
And what do you think the reason is? I wonder if you'll give the same answer now that we're recording. What do you think the reason is that the bio-based materials managed to sort of get the thin end of the wedge in response to Grenfell?
I think it was a distraction. I mean, the materials that were on fire there did a very good job at pivoting and casting blame on the materials that weren't on the building. And I mean, that's a kind of broad understanding of it. And I think, this week it's in the news again, and we'll see what's going to happen. But I think for us as architects and the insurance industry and everybody that's lined up behind that, it's problematic. Like, it set this movement back with a family of materials that had nothing to do with the incident.
I fully agree. I just wonder whether your experience in other countries, I know in North America, Japan, Denmark, everywhere else, there are many places building tall timber buildings way beyond 18 meters. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I think, as a Canadian, I could speak with some authority. We looked at mass timber buildings in my studio in Canada, the United States, the UK, and Sweden a couple years ago. Everything in Canada is built out of wood. Every small house is built out of wood. Stick frame is the norm for construction across most buildings. And what we're now beginning to see is mass timber. Glulam has been used for over a century. Every hockey rink I played in as a kid had a glulam roof. And now we're seeing it kind of move into replacing reinforced concrete structurally. I mean, that's primarily where glulam is, and then CLT is replacing concrete slabs. We're seeing more and more buildings across Canada now using that technology, using mass timber, which I think makes sense at that type of scale. And you see it in Scandinavia. You see it in parts of the world that have a wood culture, right? I would argue that the UK had a wood culture. I mean, the ceiling above us is framed in wood, right? Much of it came from Canada back in the day. All of these buildings used to use wood as spanning elements, and that's what we're doing once again. Like that the ceiling in this room is a form of mass timber, I would argue. So we've all had it. I think we've just kind of forgotten about it, and we're rediscovering it now as a response to, partially as a response to reducing the carbon of buildings, but also opportunities to use, other bio-based materials.
I think it was you that told me the reason that we don't use as much timber in England as in Scotland and Ireland is the Napoleonic War. And if it wasn't you, then I'm going to have to finish the story myself.
It wasn't me, but
On you all. Yeah, so in the Napoleonic War, England were at war with France, but obviously Scotland were not, nor was Ireland. So while the English chopped down all the forests to build boats and sell, the Scottish didn't. And so now 80% of homes in Scotland are built in timber frame still, and 10% of homes in England are built in timber. Isn't that crazy? But and same in Ireland. So a lot of the timber frame companies I used to work with were Irish.
I thought that it was more that they went for, I mean, we should do some research into it. I thought
this is
more,
entirely anecdotal.
yeah, this is also anecdotal, unevidence based. But I'd understood, because a lot of in the forestry in the UK is obviously not always of very high quality. There's bits of it, but a lot of it's quite bad, and it's a lot of high water content, quite fast growing, and for paper and kind of other products, that's not very good quality, like the Scandinavian forest and stuff like that. I mean, there was historically, but maybe that was where it started. I don't know, or whether it was just Victorian kind of entrepreneurs cutting down trees and
Well, I mean, clearly my reading of the English landscape is that, yes, it was all once one forest, and it got completely deforested by and large. I mean, you go to, you see a house from the 1600s, there's one in Walthamstow that it's got big timber sections, and they did not come from far away. So that the historically, everything was built a timber frame, until masonry began to come in, et cetera, et cetera. But that I think even in this point in time, building out of wood, like you're sourcing your wood, the buildings that are built out of wood here are typically sourcing their wood from Bavaria, Austria, southern Germany. That's where the majority of the mass timber in this market is coming from. And I think if you see wood as the global material commodity that it is, like, that's fine. It's, bringing things over on a train or a boat is a great substitution to, I don't know, mining them on a mine that I worked on back in the day in Zambia, and having to move around different smelters to ultimately, end up as your structural member. Wood is so much easier to trace.
So is your conversion to the sort of environmental movement, particularly embodied carbon, coming off the back of having been, like, I missed that part of the story where you were actually in the mining industries, because you couldn't get much further away. But so were you always interested in operational, or did you not at the point when you were involved in mining? Were you like agnostic about sustainability?
I always, good question. I think, when I graduated I finished grad school in 2008. I was always, quite minded. I always had a problem with the word sustainability, and maybe we can come to that. But my thesis was around resource extraction and the history of resource extraction in Canada. You can't understand Canada's development without understanding the kind of eras of resource extraction that have shaped it. And we were a colony. We were based on forms of kind of multiple forms of extraction, and then understanding the contemporary Canadian economy is so resource dependent that I found myself interested in this. I had my best friend from high school. He was working in the oil sands in Alberta. I was in grad school in Toronto, and I found like his life seemed really interesting to me. So I wanted to go and see what he was doing, and ultimately I did my thesis based on that part of Canada, a town that went from like 5,000 to 100,000 in 10 years, all around one resource, right? Complete boomtown phenomena, and what that urbanization looks like. And then out of that, I kind of found myself working for a practice based in Toronto that did work with the resource development sector, mining companies. A huge portion of the world's mining companies are headquartered in Toronto and listed on the TSX. And so I found myself working in Zambia, Mongolia, Ghana, Panama, Turkey on Canadian-owned mines, mostly metal mines, mostly metals that find their way into buildings. And I think and all of these mines have an urban issue that we are working to solve, be it housing for the workers that work on the mine, or having to move people to make way to dig a hole. And then I was kind of interested, I was really interested in what that reality was. And then it was then moving to Rwanda soon after and taking a job with MASS, where I was building hospitals, building universities, having to figure out how to make things, where what was fascinating to me is the things that were most expensive in the building that we were always trying to figure out how to limit, to bring them on budget. We had to limit metals. We had to limit cement and steel, because that was the most dear part of the project, which was ironic because that's also the part of the world where it was all coming from, right? And I was like a real eye-opening couple years working there, because I went from a context where labor is expensive but materials are deemed cheap, to a context where materials are expensive but labor is abundant. And that inversion completely frees you up as a designer, because you get to then oh wow, we can customize everything, right? Like we could design everything. And then but also the constraint.
But you just can't have any bolts.
But the constraint was, we can design everything because we can make anything, but the palette of material is much less.
Yeah.
Right. And it was eye-opening. And I think it was that kind of the inversion of the experience that made me realize, then looking back at my training as a kind of Canadian architect, of like how poorly equipped I was, like in that setting. Like I jokingly, I call myself, like, we're trained catalog pickers. Basically draw a rectangle, refer to this, refer to that, refer to this. We're just basically assembling stuff out of catalogs as opposed to actually understanding it. And my first time I ever drew a window, like actually drew a window and understood how it like worked, was in Rwanda. Up until that, I just drew a rectangle and said window,
Make it window.
Yeah.
I also think you don't really think about the quantum of, like, because you'll draw a plan and then you'll draw a section and it shows a bolt.
Yeah.
And you think one bolt, and you don't think, no, that's every 300 all the way around the building. And I had the same building stuff in Ghana, where like a bag of bolts was like $100 and the whole thing that we were building was like $2,000. So you're like, okay, well, we're only going to get one bag of bolts then, aren't we?
Yeah. So it's going to make your decision.
Yeah.
So how do we advocate, or how do we make change? We've got a world at the moment that's kind of very relevant, the kind of oil sands, resource extraction, tariffs going up. In some ways, tariffs may encourage people not to import and bring things around the world in a kind of crazy way. So in some ways, weirdly, some restrictions there might move, but I'm just interested in how we kind of bring it back. Are we educating architects, changing the system? What do we need to do?
Well, I think first is education. Like, we need to understand this. So, the learning that I have, I've subsequently been teaching to get architectural students to think about this, engaging practice, and now we have a contract right now with the National Research Council and the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada to train 2,000 architects across Canada this year to get life cycle assessment into their design process, to understand these issues and think about how they inform your design. So we're doing that. And then the second thing is eyes wide open, making decisions more intelligibly about our selection, our material selection. That is where our agency is. Like, we specify, right? Brick comes from here, radiator comes from that supplier. And so the more we have understanding of our ability to make good decisions, that's how we exercise our agency.
So I don't want to disagree with you too strongly, but I think our agency is quite limited. And I heard you before we start say to John, architects in the UK don't really design, the planners do. I would say take that one step further. Like, the building regulations is incredibly prescriptive, really, in terms of limiting the amount of things that you can build out of. And so where is your agency? Like, it's very, very, very hard to not pick, and to pick something that isn't made predominantly of cementitious material.
And also, you need all the British standards and whatever when you're specifying. So if you're talking about in Rwanda, your windows, they're probably absolutely fine and not too different from the ones in the window behind me.
Pretty much.
But you would not it wouldn't comply with probably any of the British standards and everything else. And so you probably weren't being held to specific regulations in the same way. You're just building a building that hopefully functioned reasonably well, So you've got a challenge of the kind of highly regulated UK and Canadian Western market.
So there's two things. Okay, within the codes, the building codes, the standards that we operate in, within the planning regulations we operate, there are choices you can make already. Like a complying brick, you have multiple choices of what brick you specify, and that understanding that if you specified a brick from one country versus another, that they would have very different environmental profiles. That is step number one. That's the basic literacy we're trying to provide. And within that, with kind of to the tariff, this world that we're living in tariffs right now, I mean, Canada's going to face 25% import tariffs next year.
Not once you get invaded, then you'll be fine. Once you're part of Greater America. Sorry, that was,
I won't go there.
Really too sensitive.
But the 25%, like what that means for Canadians is that, wow, you really need to pay attention where you source your material from. I mean, this is working in Rwanda has an 18% import tax. Tariffs are great if you're a developing nation like Rwanda that has an abundance of labor, because it moves the money towards your domestic labor source. Tariffs are not so great if you're in the United States in that situation, right? You're making things more expensive now. But what it means for Canada, which so much of our, timber specifically goes into the American, markets. But if you're a Canadian architect and builder, you really need to pay attention now what you're specifying, because it could instantly become 25% more expensive next week, right? I had silver lining for Brexit. I was hoping, I was like, hey, maybe this will help domestic material production and domestic suppliers and craft.
We haven't got
at some
any.
point.
We haven't got any. We've got no stuff here.
Yeah. Well, you do. I think there is a kind of burgeoning movement here of like making stuff here out of what is here. It's a bit niche, like your friend's Material Practice, which is just down the road there, making things grown in a field outside Birmingham. Like, it's possible at the scale we're talking about. It's not there yet, but if we thought about, okay, we need to get to this point, like we took a 20-year perspective, how do we make this code compliant? What are the regulations that need to change? How do we build the kind of, the right movement around certain materials or certain families of materials and the kind of elements that you could be making here to get them through the code compliance, right? Because so much of the regulations that exist right now are prohibitively expensive to get certain materials through, and they're made prohibitively expensive intentionally, right? They've been made by the companies that can afford to do it. And the regulations we operate under, like, we've gotten to this point for a number of reasons, and I think we need to see the opportunities to work together these are the reforms that need to happen. How do we get people in the room to make that happen?
Well, that's what you said that you have had experience of kind of like, effectively lobbying for more bio-based materials.
Yep.
I think that's one part of it. So there's a relaxation of regulation. I like to think of myself as a sustainable libertarian. There needs to be less regulation, more incentivization of sustainable choices.
Yep.
And that needs to be a government thing that is done, like to deregulate some elements but incentivize others. And then at the same time, there's an industrial strategy that needs to happen, because we do not, yes, we produce some stuff, but not a lot of it. So I've specified a UK-based brick before, from York, handmade. It was amazing, but the clue's in the title. It's handmade, so it was 300,000 bricks or something. It was made by over a 6-month period, and there's no factories that automate the process of brick making in the UK. I don't think there maybe is now, but there wasn't then. So they're all hand thrown, which is incredible to watch. But can you imagine making 300,000 bricks? Like, it's insane. And so you need an industrial strategy to be able to deliver like any sort of scale that's going to move a dial, because otherwise Ibstock's going to make them in Holland and it's not that far away, and you might as well do that.
Yep. Absolutely. I mean, you need full integration. I would agree. I think we need far less regulation in planning. And what we do have needs to be made performance-based and not prescriptive, right? What are we seeking to achieve? What are the right metrics that we could measure that achievement is conforming to it? And how could we automate parts of it, make it much faster, make it much clearer? So that is one piece of it. The second, around the industrial policy part, I mean, the work that I have been involved with is around getting targets around embodied carbon for the city of Toronto, working with the federal government of Canada. In my mind, getting embodied carbon in the discussion as the first point of like, okay, we need to get our buildings to lower their embodied carbon over time. Here are the maximum thresholds. How are we going to do it? Well, we're going to change planning, and we're going to change the family materials we're building out of, right? So that's the kind of next step that falls out of, I think, setting that ceiling. So industrial policy, again, I think in the UK, it's exciting to think about what is the future of the landscape of the United Kingdom, and how can we make land use planning a part of an industrial policy. Like, yeah, there's no forests here right now, but there could be in 20 years if we took a much more macro look at this. What are the species we want to plant now? How do you change land uses around, fully so much of the UK is pasture? How do you transform that pasture to other uses potentially? I know that might be a bit controversial, but we need to think about things a bit more macro, and the relationships of urban development with rural development. I mean, this is the one thing, certainly in North America, that I think has been really problematic, is that we've turned our back on rural issues. And for me, a move to bio-based materials is a huge opportunity to connect the economic investments in cities to rural communities. I mean, my family is, grain farmers in Manitoba. You can make buildings out of straw again Guess where that money goes? Rural communities, into farming, into agriculture. And you can link up the future of agriculture with the future of construction.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a fantasy that cities are kind of there, but actually the whole countryside, particularly in the UK, is quite a manufactured environment. You know, there's been thousands of years of development of different types of farming. They did do that in the past. You were talking about trees. They grew specific oaks to build the ships to kind of go to war and all sorts of things. So I think it's, we should be thinking about that. Going back to like the tangibility of carbon, I do think with the education piece, for me, even a person, I've done a lot of work on embodied carbon. I've done my own calculations on it. We've got tools to do it, but I still find it hard to picture sometimes. I do get the thing, and I do think that maybe between us as an industry, we need to be trying to physically and really like slim down the kind of what is a ton of carbon, or what, how do we do that? So there's actually like physical examples, because for me, I think most people can't understand that.
The enormity of it,
the enormity of that. I mean, it was really nice. We'll stick them up on the podcast, but you showed for like, I think it was like metal extraction, and you've got all these windows being made, and you see these like waste ponds of like miles wide with like filthy water and everything else in it, and that's I'm going to pick that nice window for my for my house, my office. It's not what you think.
You don't see the refining on the other end. I mean, that was the thing, having worked in mining and seeing those landscapes firsthand, I just got like some chills thinking about some of it. Like if you ever go to the oil sands, it will change you. If you're familiar with Ed Bertinsky's work, he's a Canadian photographer and filmmaker who's been photographing these mine sites, like these mine landscapes around the world, but like driving through it and the scale of it, when you're driving for a whole hour just through tailings ponds, like it changes you. You see a hole in the earth like that fucking big, and the tailings pond in the middle of nowhere. And what that actual impact is, and the people that live around these things that have this toxic legacy, next door to them in perpetuity, because we want more aluminum, mullions in our next project. That window has a story to tell, and like metals specifically, and aluminium more than any metal, like it's like the parallels with food. This is how to make it understandable, right? Over the last decade or two, we've become far more conscious about where our food comes from and what its impacts are, right? Like, probably reduce the amount of red meat that we eat, more plant-based diets, et cetera, et cetera. If you took that same look at the materials we build out of, our plant-based diet is the bio-based materials, and then the red meat are the metals, and the Wagyu beef is aluminum. Right, but we as architects, we like eat
delicious. We
are eating Wagyu beef for breakfast, lunch, dinner, afternoon snack, midnight snack. Like it's like we use it all the time. We are not using it in the kind of, in the way we ought to if you'd saw it like what it actually represents.
Like if you treat it like gold.
Yeah, I mean, it's got like higher carbon than gold even. So. Because of the process required to make it, it's so energy intensive.
Are you positive, or are you like optimistic about change that can happen, or have you seen too much?
I think I've seen enough I have to be positive. I've got 2 kids. I'm going to tell myself like I have to remain positive and think about how I'm going to spend the time I've got to make sure that the world that they enter is more informed, and I don't know. I mean, it's going to be a different world. I think what the reality is, the world that we were born into in the late 70s, early 80s, I'm going to guess, is already so different than the world that my children have entered. And where are we going to be in 40 years? So I'm optimistic that we can really move this Titanic around. Right now, it's really hard to feel like that, I think, given everything in the world that's happening. But within that, I think that I'm hoping that we come on the other side of this moment, much more connected to making decisions rooted in where we're working and less global. I think like the reality is a lot of the work I'd been doing was the product of globalization. And if construction, in my mind, if construction can become more regional again, it'll become more literate in its impact. and also it'll have more positive impact on the communities that it's immediately serving. I think that's the work that we did in Rwanda. Is every building is an opportunity to take the millions of dollars in construction and put it in as many pockets as possible in that place. If we saw that here, right, like that's the opportunity as a kind of economic potential.
If we're talking about architects and specifically, I think that physical education, almost you did in going back to Rwanda and making things more simply, was quite a big change in your life. Huge. And I think for me, I went back and trained as a carpenter, and like literally lifting up things, right? When you're kind of drawing stuff, you don't quite appreciate how big stuff is and how heavy it is and how you fix it and all that kind of stuff. So I do think the academic nature of architecture is quite creates a form of detachment from what we're actually doing that I think should change.
I think even when you go to build site, like, and you do the most basic thing like laying a brick, and you get that thermal reaction when the cement's going off. You're like, fucking hell, these are chemicals here. It's like everything is quite toxic, and all of the sealants smell really bad, and like you don't get that from the paper that when you're drawing it.
No, that's what I mean. So I do think there's something we've become quite divorced from that, and
Definitely.
therefore I think you called it
it's like being a
architects.
chef instead of not understanding that the slaughterhouse, just cooking the chicken without thinking about
the abattoir,
the chicken being plucked and killed, and
completely. Yeah, they get your hands dirty. I was fortunate to like build houses in my undergrad for a summer job for a couple of years, and then go work in a part of the world where you're more proximate to your materials and the people, very proximate. I think that there's the practices that I'm really admire in this part of the world are getting back to that, like doing courses in, go spend some time doing like plaster and lath, or when you're renovating your house, or I did a loft extension recently, I took the time to like specify wood fiber board, sheep's wool, natural paint. I made every decision because I got, again, 2 little kids. I was concerned about off-gassing, very, very thinking about the toxicity on the interior environment. And then having conversations with our builders who were just like, 4 guys from Essex who were thinking I was crazy for not using Celotex. And starting a discussion with them about like what they were doing and how they felt at the end of the day when they use these products versus, the sheep's wool.
Did they notice a difference?
Huge. I mean, if it blew my mind that the bog standard loft extension is taking a sheet of Celotex, hand cutting it, and basically pushing it between the joists for it to. So it's like that is how you're insulating roofs here. They're like, yeah, that's standard.
That you can still use Celotex.
What's that?
It's the only place you can still use Celotex.
Well, so they hand cut it, and if I'm like, how do you guys feel at the end of the day? They're like, not great. Our hands are itchy. It's kind of hard to breathe. I'm like, yeah, you're dealing with a highly carcinogenic material all day, and you're not using a mask and your bare hands. You're not going to feel good about that. I was like, well, tell you what, I'm going to pay the 5% extra to get sheep's wool and wood fiber board instead of Celotex. If the job takes any longer, from a time perspective, I'll pay you for it. Okay, no problem. They'd agreed to do it. They went, did the install. No, not like didn't take any longer. I said, so how was it? They're like, yeah, it was great, super easy, but it stunk a little bit, right? Because the sheep's wool has a kind of barnyard on it. And I asked them, would you use it again? They're like, yeah, maybe. But it's up to the next home builder to kind of insist on it. Yeah. Because the majority of construction in this country is small additions and renovations and loft extensions and rear additions. That is the vast majority of construction in the country by small builders. And small builders operate within like a mile or 2 radius, and they go to the same screw fix or the same B&Q, and they'll use what's on the shelf there, right? That's the system we have.
Or what they did last time as well.
Or what they did last time.
They'll go to the person specifying it. Oh, you don't want that.
Yeah.
I use this.
I just use this. Yeah.
I just use Celotex.
But in that instance, I was like, the next time you do this, I was talking to him about, listen, you guys are all in your 40s. How long do you want to be doing this? Because if you keep using these materials, it's going to shave years off your life. And they're kind of like, I was coming back from Edinburgh a few months ago, sat next to this like Scottish builder, sat down, him and his wife were coming down to London for the weekend, got talking to him, had his own building company. And I asked him, I'm like, had this discussion with materials. He's like, Kelly, you have no idea how many people I know that die early. from
Yeah.
like various types of cancer that work in construction. I was like, I'm not surprised, because we're not having this discussion about material health and that aspect of it.
Yeah, cutting blocks, so bad, the cementitious materials from cutting blocks, but actually stone's very bad as well, and that's natural.
Well, any of these,
Any dust that you're
the
inhaling.
particulates and then the toxins that are in the things that we build. I mean, if we really understood it, would we still be using these things, right? And how the builders, I mean, I think it's again, our responsibility is inherently in what we specify and what we draw. And the more literate we are in that agency, in what we specify, like, we would be making very different decisions. If you knew, as I like to say, it's like, would you want it in your house, or would you want to live next door to the factory that makes it? Because that's who's really impacted.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Kelly. That was really, really insightful, and very much enjoyed it.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Kelly. Great to have you.